Is Ukraine still winning the war against Russia in 2025? This is an important question that many people ask me every day. The answer is not so simple because we can't just look at the battlefield situation or the military aid packages to find out who is winning the war. We also need to look at other aspects of this war, and so let's talk about it. I'm a U.S. Army combat veteran. It's been 3 years since Russia invaded Ukraine. And so today I want to take a look back at what has changed for Ukraine since 2022, how they are still winning the war. But more importantly, what challenges lie ahead in 2025? And to answer whether Ukraine is winning, we have to talk about what the goals of this war are for Ukraine. And while Ukrainian President Zelensky has talked about expelling Russian troops from all of Ukrainian territory, which includes Crimea, which Russia illegally annexed in 2014, but also the Donbass region, which Russia has supported separatists in controlling in the east since 2014. And of course, Russia has now fully invaded the entire country. That's not realistic. Not only does the Ukrainian military face a massive Russian army, but it would also require a political solution. And I think realistically, Ukraine is going to have to make some territorial concessions to Russia, perhaps giving up Crimea and perhaps giving up some territory in the east in order to end this war. Now, has anything changed that makes Ukraine less likely to be able to achieve that goal? And the answer is yes. So let's talk about what those things are. The level of military support that Ukraine was receiving in 2022. In 2022, the United States, European Union, NATO countries were very quick to send Ukraine military equipment to fight off the Russians. You may remember images of European nations, even though they were very risk-averse and cautious about sending lethal aid to Ukraine. Eventually, they did start sending tanks, armored vehicles, artillery systems, and anti-armor systems like the Javelin, and the longer-range HARM anti-tank missiles. And of course, the U.S. was also providing military assistance to Ukraine. So there was no shortage of weapons. Ukraine had the tools it needed to fight the Russians. But in 2025, the situation is completely different. First, because the U.S. Congress has refused to appropriate additional funding for Ukraine unless the White House provides a detailed plan about how this money will be spent. And then second, because European nations, especially Germany, France, and the UK, have all sent most of their excess weapon stockpiles to Ukraine, so there's really nothing left. Now, they continue to send military aid, but it's a trickle compared to what was flowing in 2022. And moreover, some of the weapons aren't even being used by Ukraine to fight the Russians. For instance, German-made Leopard 2 tanks were sent to Ukraine, but instead of using them, Ukraine is repairing them and then reselling them to third parties like Turkey for exorbitant profits. So that certainly hasn't helped Ukraine. And in fact, I suspect that the increased corruption that we've seen in Ukraine over the last year is due to the opportunity presented by this war. So as a result, Ukraine is not in the same position as it was in 2022 when it came to its military capabilities. Back in 2022, Ukraine was getting new tanks, new infantry fighting vehicles, new artillery systems almost weekly. But now, Ukraine is getting older, worn-out equipment, and often having to cannibalize other vehicles to keep their armored vehicles on the battlefield. The second way that Ukraine is worse off today than it was in 2022 is that the Russian army is better today than it was in 2022. Third, the international political situation has changed. When Russia first invaded Ukraine in 2022, the world was shocked. The brutality of the Russian army, as it committed war crimes and human rights abuses across Ukraine, was appalling to everyone. And so the world responded with overwhelming support for Ukraine. But since then, the world has grown weary of this war. There are protests against sending more military aid to Ukraine in the United States, in Germany, in France. And there are calls for peace negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. So the political winds have shifted. In some ways, this works in Ukraine's favor. After all, Putin needs to end this war. His goal was to quickly capture Kyiv and overthrow the government, which failed. And then he wanted to conduct a limited mobilization to capture the Donbass region, which also has failed. But now Putin has framed the war as a struggle between Russia and the West, and that the goal is to defeat NATO and prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. And that's something that could unite the Russian people behind him and give him the political space to keep fighting this war without any end in sight. And that's bad news for Ukraine. So with that in mind, it seems that the only way that Ukraine can win this war is by achieving their military goals on the battlefield. So let's talk about that. Has anything changed with respect to Ukraine's ability to win on the battlefield in 2025 versus 2022? And the answer here is mixed. First, Ukraine's major offensive operations have stalled. In 2022, Ukrainian forces launched successful counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson. And in 2023, Ukraine launched an offensive in the Zaporizhia region, which resulted in modest gains. But in 2024, Ukraine has not launched any major offensive operations. And so their control over territory has remained largely unchanged for the past year. So on one hand, you could say that Ukraine has lost momentum in the war. On the other hand, though, you could argue that the reason Ukraine has not launched offensive operations is because they are saving their strength for the upcoming counteroffensive, which we know is coming. All signs point to Ukraine planning a major counteroffensive in the summer of 2025. And Ukraine's general staff recently announced that they had already begun this counteroffensive, although they didn't say that in English. They said that they had begun it on August, but either way, we know it's coming. And Ukraine has spent the last year training new brigades, proving its logistics and gathering Western equipment for this counteroffensive. So while it is true that Ukraine's major offensive operations have stalled, that doesn't mean that Ukraine has become weaker. Second, Ukraine's strategy has changed. When Russia first invaded, Ukraine relied heavily on its special forces and regular army units to conduct guerrilla operations against the Russians. But since then, Ukraine has stood up new National Guard brigades, and these brigades are trained in classic NATO maneuver warfare tactics. And they're prepared to conduct large-scale offensive operations. So the Ukrainian military is better trained today than it was in 2022, and that bodes well for Ukraine's chances of winning on the battlefield. Finally, Ukraine has one major advantage over Russia, and that's the quality of its troops. While Ukraine has suffered heavy casualties, too, they have maintained a system to replace those losses. And the key to Ukraine's success has been the foreign fighters who come to join the Ukrainian International Legion. These soldiers, many of whom are veterans themselves, bring with them real combat experience and the sort of tactical proficiency that cannot be taught at a school or in a classroom. No. And so these international legionnaires have made up the tip of the spear for Ukraine, and they remain a critical component of the Ukrainian military today. So is Ukraine winning the war? It depends on what you define as winning. If winning means completely defeating the Russian army and expelling them from all Ukrainian territory, then the answer is no. But if winning means achieving a stalemate on the battlefield and gaining favorable political conditions for peace talks, then the answer is yes. So while Ukraine may not be winning the war right now, it still has the opportunity to do so. And the coming months will be critical to Ukraine's future. If you want to see more, check out my podcast, where once a week I talk about the war in Ukraine and other topics in international security. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.